Well, today we have a returning guest, someone that many of you are always keen to hear from because it's so hard to get any facts that are pretty brutally sticking to the objective reality of what's going on in the Ukraine war. And today, Colonel Douglas Macgregor returns. How you doing, sir?
Great, thanks, David.
Now, I wanted to bring you on because there's been some big developments that we've heard in the news. We've heard of things like Bakhmut has now been completely, conquered by the Russians, it appears. We've also heard recently about these kamikaze drones striking close to Moscow, which the media is saying has rattled the folks, the Muscovites in that city. The war's coming closer to home for them. How do you see where things stand now with kind of those two things as the backdrop, and anything else that you'd like to?
Well, as a general observation, and this is, I think, very important for Americans to understand, I think we've reached a point in this conflict and crisis that is probably more dangerous than it has ever been, certainly since 22 February, and perhaps the most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have an unwillingness in Washington and its closest allies in Western Europe to really talk to the Russians, to find a way to end this tragedy in Ukraine, to stop the complete destruction of the Ukrainian state and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. There's just no willingness to do it. And the Russians are now confronting the reality that since we are unwilling to negotiate, that not only will they have to continue to press this war to the finish, but they may actually have to mobilize the nation to go to war. And I think these things are points that Americans are not hearing about. Now, you mentioned two things. One was Bakhmut. Well, Bakhmut was essentially a trap that the Russians set for the Ukrainians. It was always Zelensky who kept insisting that Bakhmut was not just another town on the map. It was a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. It was also a hub for transportation and logistics. Therefore, the Ukrainians had to fight and win it. When the Russians discovered that, and I would say they became pretty convinced that this was an obsession with the Ukrainians in December of last year, they decided to go ahead and let as many Ukrainians as possible march into the trap. So in the meantime, they've killed at least 50,000 Ukrainians involved with Bakhmut and probably wounded at least that many or more, just as a result of the Bakhmut operation. I think when it became clear that the Ukrainians were no longer going to reinforce failure, the Russians decided to close it off, which is what they've done. They finally moved in, eradicated the last bit of resistance, and have now prepared this front of several hundred miles in southern Ukraine for Ukraine's widely announced and heralded counterattack. Now, as far as the drone strikes on the Kremlin are concerned, we're not sure how many were originally launched. Somebody said 19, perhaps 20, 25, doesn't make any difference. It looks as though 3 of them got through the integrated air defenses, at least close enough to fall to the ground within, let us say, a kilometer or two of Putin's private residence. And it seems pretty clear that they were trying to target his residence. Excuse me. And I think that's pretty clear evidence that we provided them with the data and the trajectory. I think the drones themselves were probably launched from inside Russia. And people frequently say, well, what's wrong with the Russians? Why can't they control their border? Well, the Russians have an 1,100-mile border. That's pretty substantial. And it doesn't lend itself to walls and barbed wire because you have dense forests, massive rivers. So they can only protect so much. So inevitably, something's going to get through. But ultimately, the whole business failed. And I think that's why they subsequently, that is the Russians, launched a strike against the secret police headquarters in Kiev. And that apparently was very devastating. And reportedly, there were large numbers of NATO officers also present in the headquarters when it was struck. I haven't seen any real confirmation that that is true. That's being alleged by everybody on the ground over there. But again, we haven't seen any evidence in terms of bodies being removed and transported back to the United States, Great Britain, or other countries. So I think what the Russians have done now is they said, look, we know where everything is. And they do. They have the same overhead surveillance capability that we do. So that you can't hide from Russian military power in Ukraine. And the Russians have exercised, to this point, really remarkable restraint. They have not attacked cities, destroyed cities. They've only attacked weapon systems, particularly air defenses or weapon supply points, assembly areas, which in many cases were near or in cities, but they have not attacked cities. In other words, they have not done what we did during World War II, which is wholesale destroy Ukrainian cities. We destroyed Japanese and German cities. And Putin is held back deliberately because he wants to negotiate an end to this. And we keep insisting that there will be no negotiation, that he has to be driven out. Well, the possibility that the Ukrainians are going to drive the Russians out of Ukraine is about zero. So the real question is, what do the Russians do next? And I think they'll wait for this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, and then I think they'll strike. And I think we'll see their forces move. And they will complete the destruction of Ukrainian forces, certainly in eastern Ukraine. They will take Kharkov again and Odessa, which are historically Russian cities. And I imagine they'll probably close up on the Dnieper River, just as a matter of security. Now, what happens after that? Again, I think that Moscow would prefer to negotiate an end to this business. Whether or not we'll show up and do anything is unknown to me.
It says, according to CNBC just a few minutes ago, as we're recording, that drone strikes have continued to attack the Russian soil, including 2 oil refineries roughly 50 miles from Russia's highly important Black Sea oil export terminals. And so is that the counteroffensive that we're talking about here, or is there something else?
No, I think you're going to see some serious effort on the ground. The Ukrainians have brought about 30 to 35,000 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, back from training areas in the United States, Germany, the Czech Republic, Canada. They are going to be assembled and become the backbone of a new counterattack force. Now, how large will it be beyond that? I don't know. But these are well-trained troops, and they're going to try and penetrate the Russian defenses in the south. I suspect that they will try at several points, but they will make an effort at one point because they just don't have that much striking power anymore on the ground. They can't afford to dissipate their forces. That is the Ukrainians. And I think it'll fail, but I think they feel obligated to try or face the possibility that more European states will desert them and no longer supply them. And after all, the Europeans have largely run out of equipment to send and ammunition to send. We're pretty close to that as well.
So do you think they're going to continue to go into Belgorod, that area they've been talking about? They've been making
I don't think they can go into it with any significant force. Everything that went in there was largely destroyed. All the troops were killed. I don't know how many times they can do that and lose everybody they send. That's been the biggest problem for the Ukrainians. I mean, this obsession with launching offensive operations has bled them dry. We're not sure how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been killed. We know that comparatively few Russians have been killed or wounded. I think the exchange rate has been, on the whole, about 1 to 8. One Russian for every 8 Ukrainians. And I think that's pretty standard. The issue is, if you're in Moscow right now and you're looking at the strategic picture in the West, it's becoming increasingly clear that you're going to have to launch an offensive in order to bring this to some sort of conclusion. Then hope that the Europeans will want to negotiate separately. And I think that the probability of that happening is growing with each passing day. Germany has now slipped into a very severe recession that could easily turn into a depression. Hundreds of thousands of Germans have lost their jobs in very important industries, chemical industries, anything that is petroleum based, obviously, heavy industry. Germany is really the engine of prosperity for the European Union. And as Germany sinks deeper and deeper into recession, more and more people lose their jobs, the impact on the rest of Europe is going to be profound. And once it becomes clear that the standard of living is falling dramatically, things are unaffordable or you can't get them, particularly food, then I think the people in charge are in a lot of trouble. So that's in the future. I can't predict when that will happen, but that's definitely going to happen. The question is, how long do the Russians wait? And I don't think they're going to wait very long. I think they're going to use the summer to try and wrap this up as much as they possibly can.